Hey everyone, this is Lead with Who You Are. I'm Dia Bondi, and on this show, we explore and discover what it means for you and me and all of us to lead with who we are. And today we're doing it with Alain Hunkins, author of Cracking the Leadership Code. We talk in this episode about tensions. Tensions leaders live in, trying to balance relationship building and the need for distance, the kind that allows you to make exacting decisions. The tension that we have to live in between exercising transparency but maintaining privacy. The tension that lives between action and reflection. Leadership can be a really boring topic, seriously, but in this convo, I don't think we were too boring. At least it wasn't for me, and I hope it won't be for you as we unpack these tensions and get you into action so you can lead with who you are. Let's go. Hey, just a quick reminder. You can subscribe to this show on your podcast platform of choice. We're live nearly everywhere, and you can always listen to the show at diabondi.com. If there's a leader or innovator in your life who is at their shiniest when they lead with who they truly are, please share the show with them and rate, subscribe, and leave us a review. It makes a huge difference in the reach that the show has when you let everyone else know what you love about the show. Thanks so much. Ask Like an Auctioneer, the book, is available now for pre-order. In the book, you'll learn to ask for more and get it using what I learned in my impact hobby of fundraising auctioneering. And you won't hear about a bunch of fundraising galas, but you will hear stories from women in product, high-tech, small business who've all learned to ask like an auctioneer and ended up making the kinds of asks that can change everything. Pre-order it today and then head over to the website Ask Like an Auctioneer to get your free pre-order bonuses. Bonuses so great, you probably won't even need to read the book, but I know you'll want to. Wherever you buy your books online now. Alain Hunkins helps leaders, teams, and companies achieve performance goals easier. Over his 25-year career, Alain has worked with over 3,000 groups of leaders in 27 countries, including 42 of the Fortune 100 companies. In addition to being an executive coach, leadership and team development facilitator, and keynote speaker, Alain is the author of the book Cracking the Leadership Code: 3 Secrets to Building Strong Leaders. He is a faculty member at Duke Corporate Education and serves on the academic board of advisors for the New Delhi Institute of Management. His work has been featured in Chief Executive, Fast Company, Training Magazine, and many other publications, and he is a regular contributor to Forbes magazine. He is the CEO of Hunkins Leadership Group, a leadership consultancy based in Northampton, Massachusetts. Now, we usually have amazing audio quality on this show, and unfortunately on this show we had a little bit of a glitch, so you'll hear that the audio quality from my side isn't as good as you're used to, but we're fixing that right up. In the next episode, it'll be tip-top again. Alain, I'm so happy to have you on Lead With Who You Are. So I'm having you on the show because you live in the world of leadership and you've written a book called Cracking the Leadership Code, and you have a framework, or at least there's sort of like a 3-pillar structure to how you think about leadership that says that connection, collaboration, and communication are sort of the 3 cornerstones of leadership. Do I have that right?
You have it completely right. I might put them connection, communication, and collaboration, but you have it. You got it. You nailed it.
Right. Great. Okay. So wrong order, but right components.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I wanted to talk about those things today, but also importantly, I wanted to talk about the tensions that occur for people in their real life leadership in some of those areas, so we can lead with who we are, even as we grapple with those tensions. Okie dokie?
I love that. I love the idea. Like, that makes it a much more in-depth, 3-dimensional conversation. So I'm happy to go wherever you want to.
Cool. Yeah. It's just that, it's so easy to say, the 3 components are, but then once we dive into it, there's always all of these other externalities and, but what about this? There's other dynamics that step into there and you can't tell. Yeah, you can get stuck. So I want to talk about that. So let's start with the first question that I always start with, which is like, so that I've already recorded your intro, which includes your bio and all your accomplishments, and that's a lot about you. But if you were to answer the question, who am I now? How would you do that?
Wow. That's today that feels like a pretty deep question. Who am I now? I think part of it is that I'm also in transition. I feel like I'm in a transitional point. My oldest child, my son, who's 19, just went off to college for the first time. So I'm halfway to being empty nest with my wife. We've got another child she's a junior in high school, and it's yet another rite of passage. I think, life is filled with rituals and rites of passage, and this was yet another one. I think as I think about who I am, the word that comes to mind is, it's two words: give back. Right? It's I just feel like I have been given lots of lessons, learnings, insights from various teachers, mentors in the world. And what I try to do, we talked about this kind of connection, communication, collaboration. I try to take a lot of ideas and go through the muck of the complexity and make it more simple. And so I think at this point, I'm really about trying, how can I give back and help people to, first of all, realize, I think so many of us, I know I have experienced the sense that, we kind of struggle with things alone. And I find that so many of the struggles that I face and others face, other people are dealing with, It's like, it'd be so nice if we just had some support and realized, what I'm going through, other people are going through right now. So, it feels like a transitional time to me. It feels like a very liminal transitional time.
Great. So thank you for that. I feel that as well. My kids are 13 and 16, and I can feel that the way in which I identify as a parent is shifting, and the things that I say about myself and my parenting has to kind of update with their new selves, it's a weird, I'm a little bit where do I put my hands? Nobody needs a snack plate. Nobody needs a diaper change. I don't have to arrange any play dates. They're telling me what their lives are. I don't control anything anymore. And that's a really bizarre place to be. And, actually I'm needing to do a lot less parenting and a lot more leadership in my household. If you think about it that way.
Yeah. And I think for me, one of the big things too with my son going off to college was I realized that, wow, my opportunity to be the in-person live-in role model, that's it. I'm pretty much done. And I think back and I think, crap, there's some things I think I could have done better. There's some things that I would, I'm pleased with a lot of it, but there's a lot of things I think too, and again, it comes back to how could I have been more attentive, more tuned, more connected, right? There's always room for improvement. So that's just something that's been on my mind lately.
Well, it's not over. We parent forever. I watched not recently, and folks who are listening, if you haven't done it, I think it's The Last Dance, the story of the Chicago Bulls 13 game, or I'm saying it all wrong, but anyway, their time with Jordan, and there was a moment where he was they cut to something mid-career or sort of mid-later career where he was accepting an award, and his mom was sitting in the front row in this huge audience. They cut to her while he said, "There's my mom. Everyone give her a round of applause." He was like, "I'm 45 years old, and my mom, she's still parenting me every day."
Yeah.
And I just thought it was so beautiful that even as a grown man, he could recognize, I'm getting choked up talking about it, the ways in which, she continues to parent him in a way that he probably needs now, not when he was 15. So we always, there's still a job for us to do. So how do you, I was grappling with this and I was thinking about it the other day as it comes and goes into my awareness, getting back to sort of an essential, how do you define leadership as somebody who's steeped in it all the time?
Sure. So I define leadership, I start by saying that leadership is a performing art. Okay. It is the performing art of getting others to willingly work with you towards achieving a shared purpose. And the reason I say it's a performing art is because, a couple reasons. One is, if you boil it down, ultimately your leadership, how it shows up isn't what you intend. It's how is it being seen by the other person. So in other ways, you're on stage. We're playing a role. We step into the role of leadership, and it basically boils down to your words, your behavior, right? That's your tone of voice, your body language. You are the instrument. And I come by this because, part of it is my background so I have my graduate degree is I'm an MFA from an acting conservatory, right? So I spent 3 years literally under the microscope taking human behavior apart and putting it back together again, because that's what actors do, right? When they're taking on characters. So for me, it's very much understanding that everything you do and say as a leader has an impact. And everything you don't do and say has an impact too. And if you look at the performing arts, sometimes you have to recognize some stuff has to end up on the cutting room floor, right? To use a film analogy there. And so for me, it's understanding what's the frame, what's the context, who's the audience coming into this, and what's the relationship, because the performing arts don't live in a vacuum. It only exists until there's an audience and there's this interplay, this back and forth. And the other thing, I'm a big fan of collaboration and teamwork. And before I got into acting, my whole family on my dad's side are professional musicians. And I was a violinist. I started playing at the age of 5. I went to the Fame High School in New York City for violin and all that stuff. But it's so interesting because I think oftentimes in business settings, we use sports analogies all the time, right? It's like win, lose, win, lose. But, there's another type of team, and it's a team that doesn't have a scoreboard. It's an arts team, right? An orchestra is a team. And the level of listening and give and take and collaboration to make that work well is just off the charts. And I think that so many people could benefit from that idea. So I love this idea of leadership as a performing art, and that as a leader, in some ways it isn't about you. Like the conductor never makes a noise in the orchestra, and yet is leading this entire group of people. And I think for us as leaders, it's important. It isn't about you tooting the horn, right? It's about making sure whatever horn or whatever music needs to get played is being played.
There's a beautiful TED Talk that's been floating around the internet for a long time called Lead Like the Great Conductors. If folks haven't seen it, it's worth checking out because it's a beautiful example of. Unfortunately, it's all dudes, but nonetheless, that's historic in that space as well. It's changing, but it's just a beautiful example of like how much impact without any voice these folks are having on helping. I mean, how large is a full orchestra? 100 folks? How many?
Yeah, it can be 100
right.
people. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. To make it all work and to notice what's not working and the impact they're having on musicians individually and collectively. So this is great. What kind of shows up, in my coaching work often is like, well, that's not me. When you say step into a role, you're playing a role, and some things need to get, to end up on the cutting room floor. I think of it, and I'm curious your thoughts, as like growing range. Like, because you might develop out a part or an aspect of who you are that you need to call on in particular situations and get to develop it and get to know that part, doesn't mean it's not you. It means you're growing range in the ways in which you can show up that the audience, our teams, our organization, the culture needs given your role.
Yeah, so much so. I think that, to your point of like growing the range is like anything that's new, it's uncomfortable because it's not, if it was your comfort zone, it's not new, it's familiar. And, if we're going to keep growing, we have to grow into that comfort, outside of the comfort zone. And I love this idea. In fact, one of my colleagues is a guy named Eduardo Braceño, just wrote a new book called The Performance Paradox. He worked with Carol Dweck. It's all about mindset and this whole sense of basically, how do you live? So often we have this paradox. We think we're either performing or we're learning. And as opposed to how can we learn by doing as we perform if we reflect on it? And I think, the opportunity for all of us is to step back and go, oh, right, I want to try this on. And then instead of kind of going to that fixed mindset of like, oh, I tried that, I suck, I can't do that. As opposed to going, oh, what did I learn? And being more of a scientist and a researcher to see what's working and then try a different approach, try something new, try it again, I like to coach leaders sometimes and say like, look, if you go to the gym once, you can't then go, clap your hands, I'm done. I did it once. I was like, this isn't for me. Like all these things take persistence and consistency. That's, I feel like so much of the stuff that I teach ends up being, these are simple tools. And what separates out great, effective leaders from mediocre ones is that they apply this stuff on a regular basis. But let's face it, like consistency doesn't sell. It's not sexy.
So you talk a little bit about how the command and control model of leadership is done. Like we're not a system of mainframe computers and like external nodes anymore. We're a much more distributed, network of people taking action, hopefully toward a shared goal. And you say that there is too much action and not enough reflection. This is a question I was planning on asking you. It's sort of perfect that you've brought it up right now. But I find that working in, sort of one of these first tensions, right? Reflection and action. That's a place to live in those two polarities, not necessarily bouncing between them, but living in the tension of them. And I find that working with a lot of leaders, particularly, VC-backed founders who have to move really friggin' fast because they got a heavy board, they got short runway, and they are like, they gotta go, And when I say they, I mean the things that they're promising the world that is hopefully going to get actioned through the teams that they assemble and the talent that they bring on to help them with it. But there is still very much like owned by the founder, Yeah. And so you say there's too much action and not enough reflection, but I find that working with leaders that they actually often, have the opposite experience where they're so concerned. Leaders today know that they're under the microscope, that people say yes to working with them, not just because it's a great product, but because there's values alignment, that the kind of impact it's having in the world. So they want workers, knowledge workers even, want a lot from their jobs, a lot. And so founders that I, work with, they feel that gaze, And so sometimes they can be doing a lot of reflection around their concerns, around what they're not seeing and who else they should be before they can act. And that sometimes gets them to hesitate. Can you talk about that a little bit? How do leaders and founders get unstuck when they're noticing that?
Sure. Yeah. And by the way, when I talk about kind of too much action, not reflection, I'm speaking obviously generally, right? So,
of course,
and this is kind of, and if I look kind of generally, this kind of comes out of my working kind of, we'll call it mainstream corporate America over the last 25 years. That's the general. Now, the good news is, like you're saying, you've got these VC-backed founders who might be taking and already have like made the shift and realize that the old school way isn't working and they're wanting to do it another way. And
they only grew up in that. A lot of these folks are digital natives.
Totally.
They're in their 30s. They don't even have a workplace experience of command and control.
Yeah. So in that case, then the pendulum has flipped to the other side, right? And now it's a question of, okay, so what do we need to do? Okay, and it's that trusting that if you're already focused enough on the people side and the value side, well, then let's get focused on the action side too, right? Because I mean, the tendency, and I see this where, we're like, well, it's important that we all agree to everything. And like, no, like consensus is good for certain things, but the big cost of consensus is time. And you've got to get stuff done. Consensus is not a great decision-making model. And also, most people don't even know what a true consensus process and how it was designed and what's it for and how it's used. We kind of throw around the word consensus like we know what we're talking about, but we don't necessarily know. So yeah, I mean, I'd say this is where I'd say, as a leader, hold up the mirror. I mean, there's no one size fits all. I'd say ask yourself, on that continuum between action and reflection, where do you stand? And beyond, what do you think? Get some feedback from people that you trust and not just your mom and your dog. Really ask people that will give you the honest truth and then calibrate your action accordingly.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think there is a little bit of like, well, I always have to operate in a paradigm of consensus building and without the skills or true understanding of like how to engage and facilitate consensus that is good and productive and will actually help us speed up where we're trying to go together. And this can be a really difficult, and it's not to say that, the leaders that I work with have, values and, their people functions on lock. They don't necessarily, but they do feel the burning heat of people's gaze around like, well, if my leader's not, they feel like if their leader isn't perfect, then, the entire thing is, I have to do everything perfectly or the entire thing is going to get canceled.
Yeah. And so
scary.
The one thing I would suggest to leaders in that situation is I think a lot of folks tend to, when they are kind of carrying the mantle and the burden of that responsibility, is they feel like it's theirs to bear by themselves. And I think one thing that may be really useful is to make your implicit assumptions explicit. That is, go to the teams and say, hey, just to let you know, I have these concerns, but also we have to get this stuff done. And share your internal tension with them because they'll recognize, oh, you're a human being like the rest of us. You're dealing with these tensions. Instead of thinking that you have to somehow keep it all neat and tidy and clean, because let's face it, life is not neat and tidy and clean. And so the more that you can bring people along, I think the more trust and then the more people are going to engage and commit to you and whatever project you're working on.
That speaks to the power of having an executive team built around you that you can really trust. I mean, and that are, I'm going to say that are good.
Yeah.
So, okay, I want to move forward a little bit. In chapter 3, which you sent over, thanks so much. I took a look at it, and you cite a study by Towers Watson and Oxford Economics, who asked employers what skills managers and employees will need most in the next 5 to 10 years. And the top priority came back as relationship building. So this is, again, I want to unpack a little bit of a tension that happens in here. So beyond, that sort of top rank thing was, for folks listening, was teaming, co-creativity, brainstorming, cultural sensitivity, and the ability to manage diverse employees. Relationship building is super interesting to me because so many of the founders that I work with live in, again, a space of tension and get a little confused around boundaries in relationships.
Yeah.
That they want to help people feel seen. I mean, just yesterday I was on a client call and the client was like, this team is freaking out because they don't feel seen yet. And they're saying they want to participate in something. They have no idea how to actually, but they want me to give them the answer to the thing they say they need to create. They want ownership, but they also want to be told what to do. And they want to be seen, but I also am like, what I see isn't something they want to hear about.
Yeah.
So, so there's this thing where like people want, and founders and leaders want to have connection with their teams. They want to invest in relationships, but then that can eat them alive at the same time because they fail to hold enough distance, space that allows them to both execute and make decisions that are important for the business and feel like it's not directly harming individuals by saying, no, not that, we're doing this. At the same time, they can sabotage their own ability to make, swift and exacting decisions because they feel loyal to the relationships that might be in conflict with where the business needs to go. So how do leaders, and I say leaders and founders because a lot of founders I work with, they were product leads inside their organizations, and now they're founders and experiencing leadership for the first time, not the fifth time, How do you think about exercising that weird permeable wall between too much closeness with your teams, the kind of relationship that can consume your decision making, and yet people feeling like you're connected to the org?
Yeah. Great questions. And I love the context too. So here's the thing. I think so many of us, we tend to, we live in a culture of sound bites, and it's a sense of like, oh, here's the next big thing, right? So we hear like empathy, like everyone, we got to do empathy at work and this. Look, and anything in and of itself, you take it to its nth degree, it's going to bite you in the ass, right? It just is. It's so, empathy without accountability what's that going to turn into, right? And so, or like people say like, our organization, we're like a family. I cringe when I hear people talk about their company like a family. It's like, you don't fire your kids. Like things you don't suddenly, it's not a family. It's a business we're running. So for me, I think about this this goes back to your original idea around holding tension is like, yes, relationships, yes, empathy, yes, connection, yes, trust, and, notice not but and, clear expectations, clear accountability, clear milestones for like when you hit this is what happens. When you don't hit this is what happens. But we have to put those things in place and have these conversations up front. It's kind of like, again, you look at like the rates of marriage and divorce, right? This sense of like, what do we want as opposed to hope is not a strategy, just kind of thinking, oh, we're just going to get down and work and do all this stuff and we're all going to get along and maybe it's all going to be great. And, from my experience on that, what ends up happening is, the proverbial bumps come along in the road and most people aren't that comfortable in dealing with conflict and disagreement. So it goes underground and then it tends to fester and grow and blow up eventually and then it gets messy. So, let's just have these conversations up front around what's this going to look like and making sure that works for you as the founder, being really clear on expectations. And can they be renegotiated? Potentially, but if we don't have them up front, it changes the dynamic considerably.
One thing, there is a desperation around how do I communicate this change to a particular leader? Maybe they're asking them to step aside or down, or they're changing what is owned and they have strong relationship with them, etc. How do I do it so they will feel no pain? And leaders aren't ready to even talk about it until they have a plan of how they can both say what needs to happen and make it possible for whoever they're talking to have absolutely zero reaction to it. And it's an unrealistic expectation. And so, one of the things that I consistently go back to is like, you have as a leader, I hate to say it, but as a leader, and this is not influence, it's not the same as influence. As a leader, you have a lot of power. The question isn't, how do you exercise it? It's how can you tolerate having it? Like, you get to make the decision, and you are going to have to suffer the discomfort that comes with executing that decision, and let other people, believing they are naturally creative, resourceful, and whole, and will recover from the discomfort of this change. There's a lot of trying to figure out how to have it both ways.
Totally.
So am I being too mean, or is this a thing?
This is totally a thing. In fact, as you're saying this, it's reminding me of a book I read years ago by a philosopher named Peter Kestenbaum, who did some work with Peter Block, the consultant. And he wrote this book called Freedom and Accountability at Work. And he said basically the price of freedom and accountability, which, basically you're referring to here with leaders in power, the price is anxiety, right? And that's what comes to mind to me. It's like, yeah, you know what? The burden of that is going to make you anxious because it's up to you to make those decisions. And that is part of the price of admission.
And you cannot anesthetize people to the impact of the decisions that will have to be made along the trajectory of their careers and the businesses they decide to participate in.
No, and I think it's reasonable, too, is also, you're dealing with people, outside of work who, in a lot of ways, they run their households and their families. We're adults, right?
Exactly.
And so this idea that somehow you have to infantilize them and go like, well, I got to take care of all these things and figure these things out. It's like, no, like, for example, look at the pandemic, right? That came out of nowhere for most people, the 99% of us, and I think it's reasonable in a situation like that to say, I don't know what's going to happen to you. I don't know what's going to happen to me. I don't know what's going to happen to this business. I don't know what's going to happen next week. As opposed to thinking, oh, we have a 6-point plan and just wait for it. It's coming out. I mean, that just, again, this unrealistic expectation of leader as omniscient superhero, all seeing, all knowing. And we've got to give that up. I think we have this romance with this idea, like, if I can do that, look how, it feeds some ego part of us that somehow thinks we're special and we're human. And
we wonder why founders burn out early. They flame out. It's
big time.
It's real. I think also our culture has put almost an inhuman expectation on leaders inside of, at least inside of the tech startup community.
Yeah.
What is Scott Galloway talks about, the idolatry of innovators have made these people just into superheroes. And it's not just not human, it's inhumane to the existing, tens of thousands of founders today that are trying to build something meaningful and do it in a way that is human. It's really interesting. You talk about it's like exactly setting up my next question. And I want to talk about transparency. It's something you talk a little bit about in the book. And, transparency is just even that you're saying, like, we don't have all the answers. I don't have a 6-point plan that's going to execute perfectly, all cozied up like a tight little, well-made bed. It's not going to happen. But here's what we're thinking about. Like, there's a level of transparency you're exercising by narrating the process of the things you don't know, the things that you do know, without actually being confessing, without making what you don't know everyone else's problem. So I'm curious, and I also see founders particularly suffer trying to figure out what level of transparency makes sense, where they're being honest and open. I have a fair bit of experience in the open source community. I know what transparency looks like in that space. And also having enough boundary such that they're not just transferring their anxiety onto the organization. So I think, to set up the question, I think transparency in my experience is sort of a vague term, maybe like consensus. We don't really know what we mean when we say transparent. And like I mentioned, in relationship to connection and building relationships, maintaining enough distance and space to be able to hold and honor particular decisions. As we think about, transparency, to have it be both giving you a container where you have privacy in your thinking and decision making with the bench of folks that help you do that, but also exercise transparency at a level that makes people feel like they can trust you. There's another tension there.
I was going to say exactly that. Like, I'm hearing a theme in our conversation today, which is yet another tension, yet another paradox of it's not all this or all that. It's a both and, right? And so on the one hand, transparency, you're like, oh yes, I hear that's good. Like, it's empathy. It's like transparency. It's great. We've got to do this. So you're transparent. And like, you can't, people don't want to hear your verbal stew and soup. They don't need to hear all that. Not to mention whatever kind of legal things you cannot share. There's certain things you're not at liberty to share for whatever reasons. So it's finding that it's like the Goldilocks thing, right? Not too hot, not too cold. What's the just right balance? And for us as leaders to have the wisdom to be able to discern that. And all hopefully having the right support system, going back to what you said about having the right executive team to kind of figure that out. Right? What's the impact going to be? And how can we do all that and iterate through that in a way that, we could spend weeks trying to figure that out.
I don't know. How can we?
Yeah.
Right? That's the question. How do we? I think it comes from powerful reflection questions, So around like, okay, well, you exercised some level of transparency last time. What did you notice? What worked? What bit you in the ass? And align with your own values, not just the organization's values. Like, where is that boundary that gives you enough privacy and a space for you to do the difficult decision making, to grapple with the bigger questions, the existential questions of your business?
Yeah.
But then also, like, it's in the debrief of experiences where you get into relationship and name and claim where those not too hot, not too colds exist for you.
Yeah, no, very much so. And I think that, within that, what comes to mind to me around this is the sense of, part of transparency we could say is vulnerability. It's another word that gets thrown around. You have to be, as a leader, you have to be vulnerable. Well, yes. But like, as one of my colleagues like to say, it's business level vulnerability, right? We're not asking you to share your deepest, darkest secrets, right? So as a leader, sharing something that feels a little bit personal, a little bit, and again, a little bit can mean different things to different people, but something where people go, oh, I get it. My leader, they're human, they're trying, this is what they're letting me know what's going on, to the point where when I hear what they're saying at that level, I go, oh, I get it, and I can relax, and I can trust, and I can lean in and engage further in the process.
Yeah, so as you say that, I'm kind of answering my own question here for folks, listening who maybe are my former clients, this feels familiar, is like when I think, so I really live specifically in the space, not of team building and leadership,
sure,
not in business, not in necessarily like being a business operator, but around leadership communication and how leaders can think about using their voice as a tool to align and activate people, teams, and cultures towards shared goals instead of just thinking of it as a transaction tool. When you think about exercising the level of vulnerability, to your point around where is that, the business version of that is like, what stories might need to be told that are yours that build context and meaning for the communication. But this is not a confessional. That's different. Does it build context and meaning for people? And if it's just you bearing your soul, that's about you.
Totally. As you say that, it reminds me of, I mentioned I was in acting school years ago, right? And I remember we had a guest director, her name's Margaret Booker, and we were doing a production of The Seagull, Chekhov's famous play, The Seagull. Anyway, all of which to say is, at one point in the play, this one character, Nina, one of my classmates, her name is Julie, was acting in rehearsal, this thing of Nina, and she's doing this monologue, and she's crying, and she's very connected to what's going on, all this stuff. And on the break, the director, Megs Booker, said to Julie, the actress, she said, Julie, in this moment, I really appreciate what you're trying to do, but it isn't that Nina needs to cry. It's that the audience needs to cry, right? And so it's the difference between intention and impact. And I just think about that as leaders, this isn't, like you said, it's not a confessional. This isn't about you bearing your soul. You got to think about you want to do that? Get a therapist, get a coach. There are places, I'm not saying you shouldn't do that work. In fact, if you can do that work, maybe you can bring some of those aspects of yourself to the workplace. But until you do that work, it's not ready for prime time.
Great. Okay, let's keep going. I'm having so much fun. Okay, I hope folks who are listening are having so much fun. I just feel like leadership can be so much platitudes, the discussion about leadership. That's why I'm like, okay, but how? How do we? I'm a big believer that leaders need mental models and freaking frameworks. Like,
3 questions you can ask yourself to move forward with something. This is where the rubber's got to meet the road for folks. So we can talk about things in terms of abstractions all day long, but like, then how do we actually get it into, how do we operationalize it? So there's a lot of expectation now also in the workplace. And again, this can be a point of suffering and celebration at the very same time. You're right, like this whole theme of like these polarities that we're living in, but expectations for participation, feedback, input from the group, from talent, right? From the folks, from the talent base across the board, from new hires, early career all the way on up. And not just how something should be done in an organization, the path to get to a particular, to get to a particular vision, but in even creating the vision itself. This is, again, in an open source space and other places where this is maybe doesn't reach all the way into like employee activism, but there's like that level of participation folks want to have in generating and co-creating everything. Again, is in tension with speed, but a lot of my founders struggle with the balance of allowing for participation, feedback loops, and input, and also staying true to the vision that they created in the first place. Not to say that they're, white knuckling it even when the business has to change, but recognizing that no, there's some things you as a leader you get to actually own it. Am I doing crazy talk here? But this is a difficult, everyone wants to tell you how to do it. They want you to have answers, but they don't like the answers you give, in the combination with you wanting to let people participate, but also hold on to the things that really belong only to you as a leader and a founder. How, again?
More tension. Totally. And here's the thing. I mean, let's face it. Organizations are not democracies. They're not. Right? Now, there's a big difference between everyone gets a vote and everyone has a voice, right? You want to create an opportunity for people to have a voice and give input, but to recognize at the end of the day, they don't necessarily get a vote on the decision. And to be really clear about that up front,
Beautiful. That's like expectation setting. I know that's sort of a contrived thing to say,
but it's so true, right? And so, if people are coming in, I mean, hopefully you have a vision that's so compelling that it attracts people to want to work with you, and being really clear on what that is. And this goes back to the expectation thing, because if someone is now veering so far off course, then this is no longer a good fit. We're no longer aligned, right? Doesn't mean they're a bad person, you're a bad person, but this is not working for where we need to go. And if you're trying to hijack what we're doing, that's a massive issue. So again, it comes back to, if you're the leader, the willingness to have people not like you and your vision, and are you willing to, do you have the skin? This is an interesting thing, right? We talk about this with actors, and I think it's true for leaders. On the one hand, you have to have thick enough skin that you can hear feedback and take it. And at the same time, you have to have thin enough skin to be sensitive to respond, right? Again, another polarity, right, in terms of this. This is why leadership is so gosh darn hard, right? If this stuff was easy, we'd be better at it. And, my stats and research shows that only about 23% of people think their leaders lead really well. I mean, this stuff is hard because it's all about embracing paradox and tensions and polarities.
So should we bring our full selves to work?
Oh, should we bring our full selves to work? I want to say yes with an asterisk. Can I say that? Right? Because, it's going to be a full, what version of my full self, right? Because again, any of this stuff taken out of context is, my full self, there's an old joke. I think a comedian, I can't remember which one it was, used to tell this thing about, I like cocaine because it intensifies your personality. Right? And someone asks him, yes, but what if you're an asshole? Right? So when I say bring your whole self to work, yes and no, right? So no, we don't need your we don't need your inside voice, internal, there's certain things we don't need. At the same time, I think the whole self to work, let's put this in the historical context. If we think back to, again, I'm old enough that, I started in the workplace in the early 90s. I graduated college in 1990, and I kind of know the world, and I was around and did stuff in the 80s. This whole idea of feelings at work, you check your feelings at the door, no one cared. No one, shut up, do your job. And that was again, this is the last vestiges of the industrial age command and control, old school style leadership, I call it. But we have a different world now, right? And so that movement of bring your whole self to work came out of the, God, I can't really share anything, And so, yes, we want to bring ourselves to work, but do we have to go kind of off the deep end where that's all it is? Anyway, do you see I'm skirting your question on whether or not we should bring our whole selves to work? I think yes and no and yes.
Yes, it's a sticky question.
Yeah.
And my answer right now is no. And not from a leadership perspective, not because of the leadership perspective, but because when we bring I experience people in the workshops that I do, work that I spend time in, I experience people wanting work to meet their full selves.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, dating someone who just isn't that into you, like work is not going to meet your whole self where it is.
It's a big ask.
In a selfish way, I want to give people permission to not have to bring their full self to work so that they can manage their own expectations and get the needs met by the work that can actually meet needs. And there's aspects of work that's, is going to be, you're going to be chasing your tail on that. So I want to let people hold back. I want to be like, go ahead and hold back. It's okay.
Yeah. No, completely.
But that could change next week. I could change my mind, but I appreciate again that the answer is not black and white, that it is right. It's this being in that tension. Last question for you, what does that mean for you to lead with who you are?
I mean, what comes up for me as I think about that is I go back to like, what is my personal mission, right? Lead with who you are is like, what's my mission in the world? Now, I've done some work around that, and I did work on this originally 30 years ago. It kind of woke me up to what I wanted to do and be. And so my mission is I want to create a more vibrant and alive world by kindling the fire of brilliance in people. And I know that sounds a little waxy and poetic, but it's also, I repeat that to myself, at least a few times a week, and it gets me up out of bed in the morning, right? It gets my fire going. It gets me going through and returning a bunch of emails of people who haven't emailed me back. Not something I want to do, but we've all done it and been there and have to do that. But it's because it's this, so leading with who you are is really connecting with your mission, right? And the cool thing for me with my mission is I feel like I get to do that when I'm coaching and keynote speaking and writing and facilitating and doing this conversation with you. But I also get to do it when I'm hanging out with my friends and being with my family at home or cooking dinner or taking care of a sick kid. Just trying to remember that, because I don't know, but again, I'm going to get a little deep here for a moment. My father passed away a couple of years ago, and that's another rite of passage, right? It's like when you suddenly lose a parent. And this, to me, this whole kind of temporal sense of, we're not here that long in the great scheme of things. It's kind of can go by. And I'm looking at that now like going, holy crap, my oldest is 19. And where'd that go? And everyone says that, enjoy every minute because it's going to go by. So for me, leading with who I am is just being mission connected. And as I say that, the word that comes to mind is grateful, is being grateful for the opportunity. Whether that opportunity feels good, bad, ugly, whatever today brings, because it's going to be something, and it's all an opportunity. It's all an opportunity, It's going to make me stronger. It's going to make me learn something. I'm going to hate it in the moment, but I guess the older I get, the more I'm starting to get more of that perspective. And if you want to call that wisdom, I'll take it, but I still feel like I've got lots of wisdom to learn.
Hey, it has been a joy talking to you. Thank you so much for grappling with all of these tensions in this space. Where can people find you and what can they do with you?
Thanks, Dia. What can you do with me? Well, go to my website. That's where you can find pretty much all things, which is alainhunkins.com. I will spell that. It is ALAINHUNKINS.com. You can download the first chapter of the book for free. There's a bunch of other resources. I offer ongoing leadership challenges you can read all about it. There's a webpage for that. But yeah, check me out and connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm really active on LinkedIn as well. And if you read Forbes, I write a monthly leadership strategy column for Forbes on Forbes.com.
So nice having you today. Thank you so much for being with me, Alain.
Thank you, Dia. It's my pleasure.
Lead with Who You Are is a production of Dia Bondi Communications and is scored, mixed, and produced by Arthur Leon Adams III. Have a question or an inquiry? Reach out to us at hello@diabondi.com. You can like, Share, rate, and subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite shows. Go to diabondi.com for the show notes to find our tools, frameworks, content, and programs to help you and your team speak powerfully and lead with who you are.